seated magnificently on a rearing bronze-cast horse, Sophie towered over us. This work was surrounded by a small group of people, all arms folded, each wearing a version of my mother's expression on their faces. All quiet, all white. We didn't discuss this outing much thereafter, and I didn't think about Sophie again for much later, 4 years to be precise. A few months into my second year, I found myself sitting in Charlene Khan's class, feeling that same way. Arms folded, lips pursed, and a crease between my eyebrows. Quiet. The lecture series was titled Talking Back Black Feminist Creative Methodologies, and we were covering Sibande's Sophie again. Sophie, unlike the contorted sculptures and abstract paintings I was accustomed to, was so much more than just an art object. Sophie's presence alone affected her audience. In this particular case, a white audience. Although I cannot speak for my mother or the people I stood alongside in that gallery, I could see that she made them feel something. It was written in their faces, in their body language, and in their silence. She made me feel something unusual. She made me feel uncomfortable. I stood before this magnificent, empowered woman, and I felt uncomfortable. Why? Why would this figure, a figure of the domestic worker, a figure I'm so familiar with, cause me to feel discomfort? Sibande actively chooses to describe Sophie using her more laden term maid, as opposed to the politically correct term domestic worker. The word maid is loaded. It points not only to an occupation, but a violence. For entrenched in this occupation is the degrading social structures of apartheid. To be a maid in South Africa is not simply an occupation, it is an identity, a performativity. In her book, Black Feminist Thought, African-American social theorist Patricia Hill Collins ties the image of the maid to the controlling image of the mammy figure. To quote Collins, she is the faithful, warm, motherly, obedient domestic slave. The mammy, in essence, becomes the ideal metaphysical relationship between black women and that of white heteronormative power. My experience with the South African mammy is not an isolated one. A Gumtree.com advert quite aptly illustrates this uncomfortable dynamic that marks the mammification of the domestic worker in middle-class South African homes. Situated under an advertisement for a used lawnmower lies the entry, looking for domestic worker. The description reads, live-in domestic worker required, must be good with kids, clean and tidy, be able to speak English spelled with a lowercase e. Needs someone honest and trustworthy, must be able to live in and go home every 2 months. This position is full-time, so please don't respond unless you understand the requirements. Above which is a very stereotypical image of a black woman in blue overalls smiling while ironing a shirt. Similarly, another advert reads, Martha is a 31-year-old Malawian woman and has been working for us for the last year, and we immediately welcomed her to the family. She is punctual, hardworking, and trustworthy, and has proved to be an asset in our household. But we've recently had our first child and have employed a specialist nanny, so there's no longer a need for Martha in the house. She is looking to start a new job ASAP. The South African domestic worker is mammified. Her identity is defined by her occupation. She becomes something to be traded, discarded, or mistreated as her employer chooses. She becomes an object whereby one's reality is defined by others, one's identity created by others, to quote bell hooks. Having grown up in the very privileged setting of a middle-class white family in the predominantly white neighborhood of Fourways in Johannesburg, South Africa, the figure of the mammy was and is still very prominent in my life. I was taught that her name is Lucy. She wears blue or pink overalls, a white apron, and a doek every day to work. She speaks Zulu. She's kind and quiet, and I grew up loving Lucy as a mother. When I saw Sophie for the first time, I was confronted by this image. Seeing Sophie made me feel uncomfortable. Seeing Sophie made me look retrospectively at my relationship with Lucy, and the dynamic becomes uneasy. It became uncomfortable. After this particular lecture, I phoned Lucy and I asked her questions about her life, questions I had never bothered to ask before. Why was I uncomfortable? Well, the answer is quite simple. Her name's not Lucy, but rather Tokomotlala. Her family live in Cornelia in the Free State Province, and she does not speak Zulu. She speaks Northern Sotho. What I was feeling was not only discomfort, it was guilt. Tokomotlala performed the role of quiet and subservient Lucy while she worked as a domestic worker in my home for the past 20 years. Lucy's identity is very literally defined for her. She is silenced by the definition placed on her by white heteronormative power. At this point, though, it's imperative for me to note that to define Lucy by her struggle would be another violence in itself. Pumla Gola argues that black women are characterized as those who carry 6 mountains on their back, those who are burdened by a history of interlocking oppressions. This does not mean that she is defined by her struggle, it means that she is still surviving. For although she is burdened, she is able to move with them. I cannot speak for Lucy. She speaks for herself, and just like Sophie, she's anything but quiet. She was loud in the way she worked, slowly and heavily, how she sighed, and how she clicked her tongue. It isn't a matter of whether she has been speaking. She has always been speaking. The question becomes, was I listening? And more than that, when I do, how do I behave thereafter? I interviewed Lucy earlier this year in preparation for this paper, and in respecting her wishes, I have not transcribed it. I asked if I should refer to her as Toko or Lucy in this paper. Her response was powerful and sticks with me every day. She said that I did not know Toko and that I only knew Lucy. She said that when I knew her, genuinely knew her, when I can speak to her in her language, only then do I get to call her by her Sotho name. I am not here speaking about my encounters with racism and privilege in a vacuum. We exist in the teeth of a system entrenched in inequality, to quote Audre Lorde. White heteronormativity does not want women, particularly white women, responding to racism. It wants racism to be accepted as a given, as ordinary, like tea time or the common cold. Having grown up in this white suburbia, tea time or the dinner table are also concepts I'm very familiar with. Sarah Ahmed, British scholar and feminist killjoy, likens the dinner table gathering to that of this system. At the dinner table, there are unspoken, strict rules of moral conduct that each person must follow so as to behave properly. We must sit in our assigned places, be quiet, sit up straight, have polite conversations. We must keep the occasion happy. To break the rules is to upset the table of happiness, to cause trouble. A response to my question of how do I behave thereafter could be found in Samantha Weiss's paper, How Do I Live in This Strange Place? Weiss, a white South African philosophy professor at Wits University, posits the question of what is the morally appropriate reaction to one's situation of privilege. Her answer being, if we are a problem, we should perhaps concentrate on recovering and rehabilitating ourselves. A personal, inward-directed project she suggests should be cultivated in silence. For Weiss, the process stops at guilt, that we feel discomfort in the form of guilt. Recognize the reason as to why we feel guilty and remain silent. For Weiss, these habits of whiteness are disrupted once I come to the realization that my whiteness has harmed others. And to remain silent thereafter is the morally ethical way forward. According to Weiss, my voice in the public sphere will inevitably be tainted by the harmful features of what she calls whiteness. in that acting further, I cause more harm. Being silent, according to Vice, is the ethical refusal to be fully defined by what is worst about me. I sat in Charlene's Doing It for Daddy symposium last year, and I was exactly that, silent. The topic of white silence had surfaced, and one of the presenters said while looking directly at me, "I find this completely redundant that we are speaking of white silence now in this space when I can see 3 examples of it sitting in front of me." I was one of 3 white women in the room. I remember the situation like it was yesterday. I became filled with fury, and yet I remained silent because I didn't want to cause trouble. We are not supposed to feel our emotions in public, and most certainly not at the table. But we feel them anyway. Emotions are inevitable. Judith Butler defines trouble as something that one should never do precisely because that would get one in trouble. The prevailing law threatened one with trouble, even put one in trouble, all to keep one out of trouble. Trouble is inevitable. To stand quietly with my lips pursed, arms folded, and a crease between my eyebrows is not enough. The table is supposed to be quiet. If trouble is inevitable, then what is it that I'm afraid of? And so you see, that day in the gallery, in Charlene's class, at the symposium, and even now as I sit before you, it's not only guilt that I'm feeling. But when I see something as beautiful as Sophie makes me feel anything less than proud, then there is something wrong. To feel discomfort in the presence of Sophie is a very sad reality of so many white bodies in this country. And so, that day in the gallery, yes, I was feeling discomfort, I was feeling guilty, but I was also angry. Angry with myself, my family, and the people that stood alongside me, arms folded, lips pursed, and a crease between their eyebrows. All of us were quiet, and what did that achieve? What does this silent self-reflexivity do for those who have been harmed by whiteness? To quote Audre Lorde, guilt is not a response to anger, it is a response to one's own actions or lack of actions. If it leads to change, then it can be useful. It's easy to walk out of that space and not question my discomfort at all. Who would know the difference? It is easy to feel guilty. It is easy to be silent. Sophie defines the borders of the table. She is everything that white heteronormativity is not. She is affective and she is troublesome. She sparks change in both those who have been silenced as well as those who have been doing the silencing. Just by being, she upsets the table. There is a time to be silent, a time to listen and let others speak. But when we choose to be silent when we can cause change, we accept our places at the table. We preserve a space that breeds hatred and stagnation. I'm not afraid of anger, for I know that its object is change. I, for one, am angry, and I'm done being silent. And I plan on using my voice to support a broader social justice. I recognize that the struggle for justice is larger than any one group, individual, or social movement. Social justice is a collective problem that requires a collective solution. And when it comes to this story, the only thing that is essential to me is that it contribute toward this end. Women like Lucy, Mary Sibande, Audre Lorde claim the place of affectivity. They inspire a willingness to survive, a willfulness to kill the happiness that makes these problems seem inevitable. For if we will not fight our assigned seats at the table, then we must acknowledge our own accountability, that we are no better than the people that we sit with, and that being silent, we too are doing the silencing. And so, in the words of Yvette Abraham, it is not enough to be against oppression. We need to decide what we are for. What am I for? To tell this story.
We have a VGA cable, we just have to install it. Can we do that? And then we're going to next have Beverly Barry. Beverly is a master's student in art history. And her research is around is around the San and Khoi San heritage, particularly visual representation, and rethinking the kinds of knowledges that have become authorized knowledges around San and KhoiKhoi visual representations.
I'm going to start. The presentation I'm doing today is just about having an African feminist conversation about the representation of San and KhoiKhoi in rock art. I need to say that it's very new. It's not like I've been doing it for years. I'm not an art student, so it's an exploratory process, and I'm very excited to examine the colonial histories, to find those silent histories that are sleeping but not necessarily dead. And in this instance, I am following Abrams as well, because I think that the part that is fascinating me is to learn how to read between the lines and how to see through people. And an example is when we are children and you look at adults, like you were speaking about, you can actually see through adults. You can see how the system works and you can see how things are. So that's the kind of practice which I'm going to be thinking about. Also, I'm not quite sure whether I'm on the feminist, whether I'm on the womanist, whether I'm following Oyemuye's concepts of the invention of women to make African sense, or whether I'm making indigenous sense. But I am thinking of myself as a scholar, I'm thinking of myself as an activist, and I'm thinking of myself as an entry-level elder. Not quite there yet. So what that means is that part of my role as a scholar, but also in society, is to and I'm going to be quoting you extensively now, Yvette, is to find that cultural shorthand. And we know that when we're in our cultural setting with our home and families, there are certain signals that happen, and we know what that is. And as an elder, I find that young people, for older and young people, we need to start to say these things so that young children, when they hear it and they experience it, they can actually trust their intuition. So that's what I want to look at. And I also want to look at the double meanings and reconsidering my own historical and cultural learnings. Because at my age, I think I'm probably one of the best colonized scholars in the world. You know, in terms of my thinking, in terms of my education, and in terms of what I have been taught with. So, and what I have found in this reading is that the association of San and KhoiKhoi to colored is a very difficult thing. It's not something that you jump into and say, oh, I'm San and KhoiKhoi, because if you look at me, it's like a total contradiction. So, but I want to be looking at what is this political identity? Where do we come from, and how do I make sense of the colonial racial matrix of power, where one's entire being is racialized and people speak to you and look at you and act towards you in terms of your color, in terms of your culture, and in terms of your background. So, and I'm following in that area, I'm kind of looking at Walter Mignolo's work, and I find it quite inspirational. Wow. So indigenous peoples' history, as Charlene said, is located in the authorized knowledge systems of mainly anthropology and of course history. And when you think of the rock art, you know that we have it's the coat of arms, we have the coat of arms, and you have those two black figures, and that is in fact how rock art is drawn. You don't see the images of what rock art is all about, you actually see the redrawn depictions of what it is. Don't you do me a favor and just find the White Lady of Brandberg images, and then it will just come up. If you just put it because I think while I talk, So the depiction of the coat of arms is the White Lady of Brandberg. And then images there. The indigenous people, so the coat of arms has the slogan, diverse people unite. But what it is, in fact, is the slogan, in fact, omits the visibility of the very people that they intend to acknowledge. Because if you look at us, we are not figures. And you'll see the sand art on the rock art is not It's not figures. This is what has been drawn, but that is in fact how it looks. So what fascinates me when you look at it is that there's an entire background of rock art. I mean, as an artist, one of the important things is your canvas. And Kate, you have to prime it, and you have to stretch it, and you have to do all kinds of things. But when rock art is depicted, there is no canvas. It is just a white sheet of paper. So that's what I'm thinking about. So I found this quote where somebody said, Mawal Jarlai. This is his response to rock art. He says, somebody told me recently that rock art is dead. And if rock art was dead, that would not matter to we Aborigines. We have never thought of our rock art paintings as art. To us, they are images with energies that keep us alive. Every person, everything we stand on and are made from and eat and live on. I'll read it again. Somebody told me just recently that rock art is dead. If art was dead, that would not matter to we Aborigines. We have never thought of our rock paintings as art. To us, they are images with energies that keep us alive. Every person, everything we stand on, are made from, eat and live on. In this quote, Mawal Jari is told the news about the demise of rock art, its state of not being alive, of not being here in the life of the now and the future, of not existing, of not being able to communicate with, not being seen and experienced. He does not respond or react to the representation of rock art's position, its state of being, or its status, because this representation comes from a colonial authority or mandate to act on behalf of or for the indigenous people by recreating and representing their life, their culture, and their art. Rock art thus becomes a misnomer, and it is wrongly named within the context of images and energies that nurture the aliveness of life. As an alternative to the representation, the paper follows the works of Mignolo to posit the idea of representing as a decolonial enunciation which delineates the repeated presentation of indigenous visual art and culture through creative theorization, practices and productions by indigenous people. Mawal Jari, as an indigenous person, depositions rock art out of the context of a sovereign colonial death by enunciating the essence and the nature of rock art, that it remains alive with energies that rejuvenates life for everything, that is for all living nature. He talks back in an alternative way by not responding or reacting, by refusing to entertain the statement that rock art is dead. And he does this, he does not have a response, he does not give a position with a reposition or the thesis with an antithesis. The enunciation may have been activated by the statement, but it was not born from the same stem or wortel, as we'd say, or the root. The enunciation exists with or without the statement. So there is no matter to locate art within the historical colonial art depth. Mawal Jarlai's proposal causes rock art to become a visual, cultural and historical contested site, shifting from the colonial aesthetic episteme, which philosophizes about art, but which is now both a cultural and creative industry. His sense of rock art as images and of energies of sensory impression of interconnectedness echoes Mignolo's decolonial as thesis that opens up the plurality of ways to relate to the world of the sensible that has been silenced. The decolonializing aesthetic is about the will to imagine and create beyond the logic of coloniality, which places rock art in the prehistoric time, the pre-colonial time, the time when art was about human beings putting marks on surfaces, according to Danto in his article after the end of art, contemporary art and the pale of history. In South Africa, the rock figures are counted, redrawn, associated to trance dance dances and represented as the original work utilized to understand cultural rituals, practices, as well as the lifestyle of the San and the Khoi. Rock art is named and it is sold by people who own the land. In the vicinity of Grahamstown, if you want to go to rock art, you have to pay for it. It is owned by people with farms, so it has a market value where the copyrights are shared amongst government, universities, and international foundations, one of which is in Geneva, to feed the novelty demand of 4 indigenous art collectors. The colonialization of rock art operates in the matrix of power where the settler is centered, and he or she have appropriated the powers to make suppositions about what is rock art, which in this case, the position that I'm taking, is actually off the center, where there is no insider and outsider because the lines are blurred. In the time, one of the studies that I will be doing is about the San in Platfontein, and even though they are located in Platfontein, they are not from South Africa. They are from Namibia, they are from Angola, and so you have a movement of people across the time. It's not just South African. This is what Tuck and Yang refer to as decolonialization by decentering and delinking from the very foundations of the Western concepts and the accumulation of knowledge, that is the geo and the body politics of knowledge from its foundation. Oyemi Uyume, when you know you can't speak, talks about shifting from the world view to the world sense, from one view to the whole sense of energies. The rock art I want to talk about today is called The White Lady of Bradford. Okay. It's an interesting one. It's situated in Namibia. It's located 70 miles from Cape Cross, where the Portuguese anchored in 1485. And I'm only going to be talking about one text, which studied the rock art from 1929 to 1948, which is when apartheid started. And you'll see that it has been photographed. These are some of the images, but in all the images of the White Lady, you'll see that it has been redrawn and drawn over and over and over again, so that they can prove that she's a white lady, a Mediterranean woman, and and besides the fact that they count how many animals are there. Now, one of the fascinating things about the KhoiKhoi and the San, when the settlers came, and there's a lot of things we don't know about, but for me it's been quite fascinating, is that when the settlers were passing through and they were irritated by the settlers, each animal had a name. All they had to do was whistle, and that entire herd would move. Have you ever heard of that? We have schools where our dogs go to now. You go train them. That is all they did. They whistled and the entire herd would move. Even if they had exchanged it and bartered it, if they made them angry, they would just move. So for me, there's the text of rock art is like an empirical scientific study, except that, and it's about curiosity and appropriation of her face, of her color, of the adornments that she wears. And so they kidnap her out of the African context and they place her in their context. Goddesses of Diana, they likened her to the Greek god of Diana, which is the goddess of the hunt, of the moon and of birth. They've also likened her to Iris, the goddess of the rainbow, because of course she's color, and the messenger and the sea and the sky. So naming is a form of ownership which dislocates her from the context of the savage and the primitive into the realm of the colonizer. This is what Tuck and Yang call the move to innocence in their paper, where decolonization is not a metaphor, which inversely means that colonization is a metaphor, and it is a representation. In this way, they dislodge her from the indigenous people's context, while simultaneously locating themselves in the indigenous narrative. She is the one of us, and we are the one of them, what Robert Langton calls in his book of the anthropology of art, the European indigenous. Have you heard of that? Which is a full woman in Botswana, is that young girls exercise the will to decide whether they are women ready enough to be married, to have partnership, to have children, and to form a family. In Nisa's family, a man came and approached her, and she took days. She went out and she came back and she thought about whether in fact this is what she wants to do. Her willfulness of self-determination is centered in her own sense of readiness. And one historical text of which I have a clip, but I don't have the reference, is where women had the opportunity to make fun of men when they were being arrogant or when they were not being humbled, which we call they're not, you platfierce. You have to be humble. So if you're not being humbled, then they would make fun of you. And then there's also a story of Valiant, who is attracted to a young KhoiKhoi woman, and this is what he says. Her person was slender and elegant, and her shape formed to inspire love. She was the youngest of graces under the figure of a Hottentot. One would suspect that the settlers would have been attracted to the unusual beauty of women and completely dismayed by their nakedness, which would have been construed as pornography from the worldview of the European sensibility, where sexuality was taboo, and one would have only been able to see a naked body had you been an artist. One has to read between the lines to ascertain the creativity that went into the styling of the hair, the adornments of the body, which then might have been strange and extravagant, but today it's very much part of the art history of fashion to be making your earrings out of natural things like eggshells or ostrich shells. It's considered, I've got 5, I'm almost done. I'd like to also investigate the concept of parody and humor, where she may have been making fun of the settlers, performing or mimicking their culture and their language, parading their clothes and their wares, painting the white mask on a black face, and giving the impression rather than representing the becoming without the becoming.
Thank you very much, Beverly. I'm very lucky, of course, that these are my students and in our department, and that we get to hear them give such fantastic presentations. Next up is Amy von Witt, and she is a 4th-year student in the department. She's doing a BFA.
Doing this. I don't know why I should just put on. Oh, okay. Good morning. Many of the injustices in the world today can be traced back to colonialism, to the West's oppressive political and cultural assertion of metropolitan dominance of center over margin. This paper aims to draw attention to the ways in which artists working in a post-colonial positionality highlight the injustices created by Western domination and open up critical dialogues around such topics. The term post-colonial, as used here, covers all the culture affected by the imperial process from the moment of colonization to the present day. This paper will discuss the work of artists Buhlebezwe Siwani, Ayana V. Jackson, and Kanisile Mbongwa. I have chosen to speak about these artists because I feel that their work is relevant and pushes boundaries in ways that serve to open up critical dialogues around pertinent issues. I am in no way trying to speak for the artists, and I acknowledge my position as a white woman speaking about the art of women of color. However, I would rather be speaking about their work than that of white artists who have been represented in the arts for centuries. Drawing on discourse from post-colonial theorists, artists, and art historians, this paper seeks to illustrate some of the ways in which those that have historically been left out of the canon of art create meaningful work that refuses to be silenced. It responds to the fact that the weight of antiquity continues to dominate cultural production in much of the post-colonial world, and that contemporary culture exploits notions of otherness with both visual images and text. This paper will focus on identity in relation to history, with identities being, according to Stuart Hall, the names we give to the different ways in which we are positioned by and position ourselves within the narratives of the past. It will also touch on the pleasure-driven commodification of otherness embedded in mainstream art and visual culture, and the erasure of history that enables that enjoyment. As critical black feminist theorist Bell Hooks explains, currently, the commodification of difference promotes paradigms of exchange by a consumer cannibalism that not only displaces the other but denies the significance of that other's history through a process of decontextualization. How then do we deal with this problem? Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin offer that it is through the arts that the day-to-day realities experienced by colonized peoples have been most powerfully encoded and so profoundly influential. One such example is the art of South African artist and isangoma Buhlebezwe Siwani, who works across different visual art mediums, including performance, photography, sculpture, and video. Her 2015 solo exhibition, Inglowa Yagrichakazi, excuse my pronunciation, which loosely translates to The Witch's Baggage, explores themes of South African spirituality and healing, notions of Christianity, and positions the black female body in the center of the work, using her body and performance to look at ideas of purity and cleansing. In the video artwork entitled Ungazele Pansi, Siwani confronts the viewer in an honest and original way by plucking chicken feathers off her otherwise naked body. Writing about this work in particular, Ches Matakala asks us to consider for a moment that chickens are used in some traditional cleansing ceremonies during funerals. Siwani, as Isangoma who cannot attend funerals, turns to Siwani as an artist to cleanse a body which is multidimensional. Siwani, cited in Matakala, further explains her work and the use of her own naked body. We are constantly costumed by how people see us. We are costumed by historical baggage. We are costumed by cultural baggage. We are costumed by patriarchy. So the only honest way for me to actually just return the gaze, in a sense, is by me taking everything I have put on off, so that we can look at each other. Inglowa Yagrichakazi is basically about the many ways in which I was cleansed and washed, and how I feel about how I've grown up, and my memories surrounding that, regarding Christianity, colonization, being a black female body, history, culture, all of those things, and the violence around the black female body in these spaces. The art that Siwani creates is loaded with symbolism and memories that express her double consciousness, and can relate to a number of South Africans, and in this sense, her art opens up a pertinent rhetoric that is not found in mainstream Western art. Siwani further tackles Western power in her use of language in titling her work. She is multilingual and titles her artworks in isiXhosa, providing no translations. This serves to elevate isiXhosa and give it value, while simultaneously undermining English and challenging its efficacy. I will now digress to look back briefly at the visual archive. Throughout centuries of white racial dominance, the media and by extension visual culture have been controlled by white people, with the result being that the black body has become demonized and delegitimized. Within a racist context, it does not matter whether you do good or you do bad. The crux is that you can choose to do what you wish with the black body. The appropriation of the black body in pain through archives is seen extensively in photography. Okwi and Rizo speaks of dealing with the archive as a signpost, pointing to how difference and otherness are constructed through photographic presence, and how the black form is as much a grotesque bearer of traumatized experiences as it is the abject vessel of race as a point of differentiation. David Medali, cited in Hook, talks about the constructedness of memory. This is as relevant to the context of photography as it is to the context of post-apartheid fiction, from which Medali speaks. War photographs, as well as anthropological photography, both form part of archives that present themselves as contestable truths. Susan Sontag states, pictures taken by photographers out in the field at the moment of or just before death are the most celebrated and often reproduced of war photographs. Racism is inherent in the war photographs that are widely disseminated by the media, and the more remote or exotic the place, the more likely we are to have full frontal views of the dead and dying. This stems from the centuries-old practice of exhibiting the exotic, that is, colonized human beings. Sontag goes on to point out the racist injustice created by the West. The other, even when not an enemy, is regarded only as someone to be seen, and not someone like us who also sees. One of the reasons images of non-white people in pain and suffering are so widely circulated and celebrated is because of societal racism, which is driven by pleasure, joy, and triumphant emotions, as well as hate and hostility. The ethically ori aestheticizing of pain through art and photography, stems from the power embedded in white racial dominance. Anthony Farley speaks of how power, in the form of racial categorization, is a form of pleasure. He further intimates, race is a form of pleasure in one's body, which is achieved through humiliation of the other, and then, as the last step, through a denial of the entire process. We deny it through a discourse in which race appears as a thing created by nature, and not as a practice developed by a culture. Responding to the racist pleasure felt by some when seeing black bodies in pain, African-American photographer and filmmaker Ayanna V. Jackson engages with archives of North American slavery and lynchings. By restaging old photographs of such traumatic events with the use of her own body, she draws attention to the aestheticization of pain, and in so doing also critiques it. Death 2011 and Diorama 2011 are examples that illustrate this. In Death, Jackson restages a lynching with her own body. The framing of the photograph is similar to that of photographs of lynchings that were sent as postcards in America in the 19th century, and the background is a black and white mirrored scene of a lush, tranquil slave owner's estate. In stark contrast to this hangs the highly saturated image of Jackson's limp and seemingly lifeless body, lit in such a way that her body appears flawless and desirable. This juxtaposition of death with desire leaves the viewer in a moral quandary. Similarly, in Diorama, in which Jackson takes on the role of both slave owner and her slaves, her naked body is again presented in a desirable light, which serves to raise questions about the experiences of black female slaves and leaves the viewer mourning their sexual agency. Some of Jackson's slaves return the viewer's gaze, challenging them to think critically about what they feel when viewing the photograph. The over-aestheticization of her photographs is another technique that Jackson uses to critique mainstream white visual culture and the objectification and consumption of the black female body. Kanisile Mbongwa is a South African performance artist who often confronts notions of whiteness in her work. Her recent performance piece at the 2017 National Arts Festival, held here in Grahamstown, entitled Umnikelo Oshisiwe Ibanda Lomlindo, which loosely translates to waiting blindly for a burnt offering, deals with Christian concepts of sacrifice, placing the black female body in the center of the work. Her artist's notes begin with a sacrifice, a cleansing, a purification. I have no bull, sheep, goat, or pigeons to offer as the sacrificial animal demanded by God, so I offer this black human body as the ultimate sacrifice for cleansing and purification that will appease whiteness. Jesus, the ultimate sacrifice, was not enough. Now I am offering the selfless sacrifice. Within the historical context of the Christian religion, the black body has always been a site of contestation. Fanon writes, "The world rejects me on the basis of color prejudice. Black is also rejected biblically with the story of Cush. The black female body is doubly subjugated." The performance begins with Mbongwa seated center stage, clothed in a shiny black dress which flows onto the floor in a large pool of black silk. Reciting a monologue, she starts to get more and more angry, eventually rising up and taking off the skirt to reveal her body, now covered only by a see-through charcoal body net, her private parts hidden by sequin decals. She proceeds to stomp furiously around the room, emphasizing the mantra she is repeating, that Jesus Christ died to save us all, and now we must go out and kill our brothers and sisters, with the chinking of her nguni ankle bracelets. The neat central pathway of cake flour is disturbed by passionate dancing as she weaves her way between the pipe tubing hanging above open Bibles. In this moment, Mbongwa is a shining example of Sarah Ahmed's feminist killjoy, boldly taking on the role of angry black woman in order to invoke strong emotions in the audience members. She rages and glares, her fingers wag and point to give maximum offense. This is her ferocious resistance to the double subjugation of the black female body by missionary-driven Christianity. Sacrifice, cleansing, and purification are needed. and it comes towards the end, when all is revealed and the artist returns to the Black African world of mysticism, healing, and self. In an act of acceptance and healing, she then moves around the room, offering Holy Communion to the audience members. The artist's notes explain that in the wake of sacrifice, cleansing, and purification, there is waiting and mourning. We wait for liberation whilst we mourn those who went to exile. We wait for freedom while we mourn those who disappeared without a trace. And we wait and mourn the future all at once, being nostalgic about the unknown. After the performance, I went to browse some of the market stalls at the Drosty Arch, and one of the stallholders informed me that I had some flour on my bum, and that he would have dusted it off if his wife wasn't watching. This really drove the message home for me in serving to illustrate the sense of entitlement that men think they have with regards to the bodies of women. To sum up, the examples discussed in this paper highlight how we all write and speak from a specific place and time, from a history and culture that is specific. From a post-colonial standpoint, it is clear that the artistic and cultural practices are largely influenced by Western domination, and that there is a continuity of preoccupations throughout the historical process initiated by European imperial oppression. Artists, particularly artists of color, cannot simply keep quiet when faced with the centuries-old practice of exhibiting exotic, that is, colonized human beings. I've chosen to discuss the work of 3 artists of color because not only have they been historically marginalized and left out of the canon of art, there are also far too many white artists that get unwarranted academic and popular culture coverage. Too often, white artists turn to the black body as a means to express themselves, which in my view is highly problematic. Nwiso explains that the relationship of the white or black artist to the black body is indeed paradoxical, and the less anxiously repeated the image, the better the opportunity to find an ethical ground to use its index as a form of discursive address. Whiteness is such a fragile thing that it needs to be interrogated and pulled apart and demythologized, because, as Georgia suggests, it is through the screaming pain of racism that white people get life, and this is something that desperately needs to change. As Mbembe explains, for memory to fulfill its function long after the truth and reconciliation paradigm has run out of steam, the demythologizing of certain versions of history must go hand in hand with the demythologizing of whiteness. It's often difficult to talk about these things in the presence of white people. The issue of whiteness needs to be discussed without white people getting defensive, because white people's tears have become a way of shifting the focus from the slave's narrative and displacing it with metaphor. Akil Mbembe comments that South Africa is in a moment when multiple old and recent unresolved crises seem to be on the path toward a collision. The age of innocence and complacency is over. It is evident that practices of looking back at history through archives need to change, and white people need to stop trying to speak on behalf of black people. Intersectionality in representation is also very important, as the apartheid archive can be seen as a white male archive. Looking at those archives now is to be able to read what was glossed over, to introduce the black experience, the female experience. Furthermore, when looking at white representations of African identity, we must allow that positions of spectatorship be recognized, particularly in a racist society, as always conditioned by the economy of racialized interpretation as well as desire. It is true that we become alienated, out of line with an effective community, when we do not experience pleasure from proximity to objects that are attributed as being good. Thus, what is deemed enjoyable and pleasurable in society also needs to be re-evaluated, and whites have to look critically at instances where they find pleasure in viewing black bodies in pain or suffering in order to change these mindsets. White artists need to do more than feel shame when engaging with colonial archives, and not replicate painful histories in an effort to elicit unwarranted sympathy. It is also important to acknowledge the value of theory when it comes to cultural and artistic practices, because, as Gayatri Spivak reminds us, theory has become a kind of thing that's completely cut off from everything, but it is not in fact cut off. We, theorists, are the personal trainers in the gym of the mind. Further, artists and cultural practitioners have the ability to play a highly influential role in society, and this should not be taken for granted. In the tumultuous social environment we currently find ourselves in, it is vital that we use the skills and resources available to alleviate social injustices, and this includes letting those that have been historically silenced, such as women of color, be heard. Thank you.
So this room is nice and comfy, and so I think we want to just keep the comfortable atmosphere, and instead of just having the three presenters up there and interrogating them, that we can have a dialogue. It's a nice space for that. And so if you do have any questions for the different presenters, then please address it to them. But otherwise, we can just share our thoughts and comments about the presentations and the issues raised. Some of the things I kind of want to raise is the issue of quietness, and of course some of my students go through Yvette Abrams' really I don't know the adjective for what that work is, where she speaks about Sarah Bachman as a remix, and that piece always takes all our breath away, and we struggle to speak there because so much is spoken, and so this issue of silence, being made silent versus silence about when you remain quiet willingly in order to listen to others, because we can't always be talking at the same time. The dialogue requires someone to perform an act, a gesture of quietness in order to hear others, versus the rhetoric that I can't speak, I don't have a voice, I am made silent. Also quietness, this kind of fallacy that quietness is submissive, that it's a one-to-one relationship, which I think most of us disagree with, I think. Also this issue of naming. I was supposed to be on a panel of naming earlier this week, but I wasn't able to. But this notion that white supremacy tells us, like when we want to change Rhodes' name and they say, it's not really that important. Mm-hmm. And then they say, okay, it's not important to you, doesn't matter to you, it matters to me, so why don't we change it if it doesn't matter to you, right? And then the kinds of namings we have to deal with, maid versus domestic worker, indigenous, this kind of the colonial dimensions of categorizing, right? Fanon says, when I walk into a room, I am not a man, I am a new genus, I'm a new category. A man is named, but people of color become a category under which we are named. And so it's relevant to all of the speakers whose presentations, and how do we name? The importance of naming, the names by which we call ourselves, the names by which we are called, the names which we internalize, the names which we externalize, and black feminist and race theory has given us so much work on why naming is important. And then we sit at Rhodes University this week having a debate about, should we change the name from a homicidal, genocidal maniac to something we all want to identify with, that we have to debate that in July 2017. Okay? But of course, naming tells us about the power of people who have the ability to name, the power of people who give names, the power of people to take on certain names at will. I also think that there's, and just tied as well to the quietness thing was the idea of sleeping. You spoke about sleeping, and you also spoke about Mary Sibande and this completely internal world that we have. And on there I'd like to sort of, kind of, because you guys are students and I get to critique you, that we need to put back black experience, that we need to introduce black experience. Black experience has always been there. Are you introducing yourself to it? Because it doesn't have to be introduced. Also, when Beverly was talking and she was talking about how some of the how they might have thought about foreigners. I remember the Native Americans, it's been reported that they thought that the new settlers to North America stank really badly. They were like really disgusted with their body odor, for instance. Or the fact that when the German colonizers had to deal with Herero society, that they actually say that any decision that they put forward to the society, the community leaders would then go back and discuss this with the women, and how barbaric they thought of that was. I mean, why would they need to go and discuss, why would the men need to go and discuss this with the women? And now we're introducing democracy violently in many spaces. And just going back as well, some people, some of the presenters, speaking about this tension always between opacity and transparency, this cultural shorthand, how do we get known, how do we make ourselves known, should we make ourselves known, what are the dangers of being known all the time, and this kind of discomfort, that levels of discomfort is actually something that we should welcome. It's not, and lots of people, Bell Hooks, Judith Butler, speak about the dangers of having arrived rather than the process of becoming. And I think also, our title of our conference is Rereading or Rethinking African Feminisms. And I think we've become very complacent about talking about double subjugation or triple subjugation. I mean, intersexual frameworks tell us that the subjugations are almost endless. We can't just be speaking about a double or a triple oppression right now. We need to go beyond those, because it's a hell of a lot more right now in this crazy Trump, Zuma, Putin madness that we're all kind of enveloped in right now. So speaking around those subjects, I'd just like to open the dialogue to the floor.
Hi, I'd like to address my question to Erin, comment question. And it links onto what you were talking about, Charlene. I wonder if thinking about this idea of white silence might be in this current kind of social justice conversation that we're having, if a naming of that kind of silence as a white silence is perhaps not a bit centralizing of whiteness back into the conversation, since I feel like white silence is much more of a choice than many other silences that are enforced on people. So, and I wonder if any kind of questions about breaking white silence might result in whatever action taken thereafter being quite white saviory in some way. So I was wondering if there's ways that we can think of that specific thing, that discomfort, and what results from that discomfort in ways that we cross a distance between, we kind of bridge that distance between the self and the other that we constantly create in academia, by thinking of ourselves precisely as intersectional. So, for instance, the image of Sophie and yourself, white woman looking at a black woman that's a domestic worker, if that's that kind of distance that's been created by yourself and the other, can't be crossed could be crossed by thinking of it in it being two women looking at one another. So I'm trying to think of ways. I'm asking your opinion on ways that we can begin to decentralize whiteness in this conversation about social justice, and move away from ideas of like white silence and that kind of centralizing that takes place when we name it. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Thank you very much to Bev, Erin, and Amy. I remember. Sorry. So in the interest of Charlene's invitation at conversation, I'm going to throw a few things at you. Not violently, but well, imagine them as sort of not hard rocks being thrown at you, but something, I don't know. Soft. So, not too soft, but So 3 things. Erin, so I actually find your thinking around silence quite, and the relationship between silence and whiteness and white femininity and positionality and shifting quite interesting in light of, because I mean I think that sitting in the South African context, there's so much right now that we inherit, right, in terms of kind of thinking and rethinking silence, right? So we have substantial bodies of work around feminist work around thinking and rethinking silence. Charlene's work, which you are, I'm sure, very familiar with. Some of Yvette's work around how do we even think about representing and speculate, and her work around kind of what is a womanist speculative fiction? Like, how do we talk about the silences without valorizing the silence? Or even something like Polish Wasitole's notion of a shouting silent, right? Or Thabiseng Mutsime's notion of the mute that always speaks, right? So we're sitting, so right, and okay, so I'm starting with a variety of black women's very differentiated attempts to kind of think about how silencing works. But I mean, we also we sit with an equally kind of complicated and sometimes more fraught white woman's history of trying to think about what a white silence that isn't passive might mean. Sometimes productive. So whether you're talking about something like Marlene van Nierkerk, or we're talking about Antjie Krog, or you're talking about, so there's so what I found fascinating about kind of your exploration is this sense of thinking about a self-conscious silence that tries to think about guilt not as a useless emotion in kind of the self-indulgent tradition that we often kind of see with kind of the hyper performance of kind of white silence, right? Okay, I'm not going to respond, I'm not going to say anything, and this is a position of arrival, right? And so I found your kind of insistence on a kind of a fluctuating positionality in relation to silence quite productive. But I want to push you a little bit on that. I want to push you on the productivity of that discomfort, right? So what is and I don't know that I want an answer, but I suppose as an exercise, I'm interested in, okay, so what is it? It seems to me quite productive, right? This not just kind of as a self-consciously pacifying, overwhelming, oh God, now I can't say anything, right? Which So I yes, I guess I'm saying I want to push you on the discomfort, right, and on the self-reflexivity, not as a process that takes you somewhere else, but perhaps stay with it, right? Jesus, I'm so sorry. My phone never rings. And then Bev, I don't know. Sorry, can I just do, and then I won't say anything again. Bev, oh my God. Okay, so what you were saying about what happens when the canvas is missing got me thinking, and I mean everything you were saying, but particularly how you kind of positioned. What does it mean? Made me think about kind of notions about the relationship between the canvas and the context, right? And the relationship between a decolonizing African feminist, decolonizing African womanist, investment, and the relationship of that to context. Again, made me think about kind of Yvette's work on speculative history. So not so much what she's doing in that project to show kind of violence, but also what she's inviting us to think about in terms of kind of relationships to multiple histories and multiple epistemes as we produce this work that tries to think about sleeping knowledges, tries to think about haunting knowledges that both seem obvious and ever present and difficult to write about as we try in academic registers. So thank you very much for that. I don't really have a question. It's just those connections were very important. And then finally, promise, I'm finishing. Amy, I'm going to be a little unfair to you. So, I wanted to hear a little bit more about the specific work that you were talking about. What do I mean? So, I mean, you gave us quite a lot about the context. You gave us quite a lot about what they make us think about, right? What I kind of am still yearning for, having listened to you, and of course, I mean, a lot of this is because you only have so much time to present, and so you want to get as much in and out of it as possible. So I understand that. But I wanted to know more about. Like, talk us through more of Siwane's choices, right? For example, or Mbongwa or Jackson. It seemed to me that there was your presentation was incredible on the relationships between kind of the black body and whiteness and the clothing and unclothing and so on. But it struck me, two things struck me. The first one was, these are all black women's bodies, right? So they're not just black bodies. And of course you name them as black women's bodies. But I wanted more on, so for example, when, you know, the kind of relationship in Siwane's work between right? Which is a very gendered, in very specific ways, and which I'm sure you appreciate. But yes, I was missing, and also even kind of Jackson's kind of, so much about lynching very often comes to us as though it's a very specifically masculine way of breaking black bodies, right? And so little about kind of lynched black women's bodies, not just continentally, but across, and the various kind of meanings of that. But also, of course, Southern Africa has Zimbabwe, for example, has a very specific history of lynching, which isn't quite the same. So what does it mean for Jackson, who travels so much between spaces where lynching is so important, but where it means slightly, the coloniality of black bodies hanging from trees means slightly differently in Southern Africa than it does in the US, where it comes from very different kinds of contexts, but is, you know, I mean, obviously there's intersectionalities, and for Jackson to be an artist who moves so much between those spaces, and what it means that, you know, so I wanted a little bit more of that. And then you said something very interesting around language and languaging, and the refusal to translate, and what that means, not just in terms of what we often assume. Well, not we. I don't know, this we that we all disciplined into, right, as we get trained into disciplines, right? The we that is always assumed to not be a polyglot, right? And what it means, what translating and not translating means in that instance. And you talked about it in terms of primacy, and I wonder whether it isn't in fact important to question primacy, right? So when Bongwa says, "I'm not going to translate," is she in fact privileged, and Xhosa is already privileged? Is she in a world in which Xhosa is already privileged, right? So if I don't translate, if I sit in Khini and I don't translate Xhosa, am I privileged in Xhosa, or do I live in a world where partly Xhosa is already always the reference point, right? And so just the kind of thinking through what the various layers of translation means and create, and okay, I'm going to stop talking now, because otherwise I could just... Thank thank you, Charlene, for indulging me. And thank you, the three of you, for incredibly provocative and just incredible presentation.
Yvette and then Esther.
Thanks, Charlene. Pumla, this is all your fault.
Yvette, 20 years of blaming me for
Completely. You and Charlene and all these other people. And I'm fascinated by it. I mean, at one point, I actually want to take a year off and study myself as an academic icon. I haven't never published a book. I haven't lectured in 20 years. My connection to universities at best has never more been 50%. And I've since 2005, bar one ill-starred experience at UWC, I've had nothing to do with academics. And yet I continue to be cited, and it's people like you that continue to teach me, and I'm like, what's up with these people? But interestingly enough, the fact that and it could be because nobody here is doing renewable energy and climate change. I'm fascinated by the fact that the work that is being cited is from the 90s. And I've actually written since. Almost all bar one article which is available free online. So Abrams, the academic icon, what is she? Is she an inflection of political correctness? Is she, somebody I put there because I want to show that, because my supervisor says I must read her? Or do people actually read it? I don't know, but it's definitely worthy of a paper at some point. So I'm going to shut up about that, except I wanted to point out that I'm a real person and I hate being anybody's icon. Hello. Hey. Beverly, I want to say there's a personal, because my Khoisan ancestry is Damara, right in the matriarchal line, and so that's my ancestral land, that white lady. So that was just kind of sweet to see it in Grahamstown of all places. I think you need to maybe think about, are you writing about what white people have written about this piece of art, which in itself is a fascinating topic, and yes, the story of them trying to prove that she's white is hilarious. Always worth a good laugh and definitely a worthy topic. Or you're trying to write about the art itself. And it may be that you're trying to do both, but I think you just need to sit back and think, which are you trying to do when? Because they're two entirely different things. To view Khoisan rock art as it's been inflected by white anthropologists is something, but it tells us nothing about the art. And so you just kind of need to figure, what is it you're doing? I want to warn you against the anthropological fallacy, about which I'm sure if you Google it, there's lots of, the notion that because the Khoisan are doing something today that they would have been doing it 10,000 years ago is just wrong. The chain of causation goes the other. I mean, they did something 10,000 years ago, they might still be doing it today. Yes. But the modern Khoisan are as colonized as everybody else. So just because somebody does something out in the Kalahari Desert is not as an evidentiary persuasion saying that they did it at the time when the rock painting was done. So you just need to avoid that. Yeah, I mean, I hear your questions, and there's a lecture of mine on YouTube. If you Google the World Matriarchy Conference of 2005, and I give an entire lecture on Khoisan matriarchy, so that might help to answer the questions that you're asking. But what I'm saying is you cannot deduce an answer from modern day, as little as from anybody else, right? It goes the other way around. Other than that, I mean, I'm loving your project and I'm wishing you lots of luck.
It's like not even a month.
Exactly. So I thought it's a good point to mention all these things. You're asking the right questions, and that's always important. I'm having, and you must understand, this is for you too, how revolutionary this is for black feminists of my generation. I'm just about to publish 2 articles on whiteness. And it made me so uncomfortable that I actually asked permission. I called Desiree Lewis now in Des. Is it okay if I write about white people?
So
like, no, okay, do it. So I just want to say I have sanction for this. But I mean, it shows you like how discomforted, because you know the ideologically correct stance, of course, is to be a black feminist writing about blackness, and so to I devoted an entire PhD thesis to writing about whiteness, but since then actually put it aside and did grown-up things, and so to come back to it in maturity, I needed permission from Professor Lewis. But and one's going to be free online. The other one's most unfortunately in an academic publication, so you'll have to pay for it. But basically what I say is, and I'm going to approach this by way of anecdote, you know, Biko and Rampele started a white consciousness movement in 1972, and Rampele writes about it in her autobiography, and they did this quite deliberately. They said there has to be a place for conscious white people to sort themselves out. And Biko, even more sneakily citing Sobukwe, said, well, if you can split the enemy camps, and they'll do your work for you, and that will give us more time to focus on blackness, right? So they did. They supported it financially, they supported it emotionally, they provided the space. The interesting thing was once they ceased to support it, I think it was somewhere around 1974, after 2 years, it collapsed. So maybe its time was not yet. But I think their point is still valid today. I think there's a place for silence and there's a place to speak, but that if you don't have a place to speak where whiteness is a non-reference, in other words, where you're all sitting as a bunch of white people together and so you can kind of exclude race, then it's going to be very difficult for you to find an identity that allows you to speak in other public spaces. So maybe give a thought to that, and of course Rampele's autobiography I think talks a lot more about it, but give a space to where are the places and spaces in which we explore different things, and that will help you identify. Okay, so now I too shall shut up. Thank you.
I want to thank all the three presenters. I found it very fascinating as a person who doesn't produce any art but is an avid consumer, especially of movies. So I have seen the public images of Sophie, but I'm wondering if everyone in the audience has, because it really is very powerful, and if we could project it, it would be wonderful. I'm sure it's easy to find, but I'm not insisting we do it right now. But I'm thinking really about the story we heard from Erin was a kind of self-reflection. And I think she managed to capture for me the kind of paralysis of guilt that a lot of white people must feel. And what do you do with that? And I think that white people are in a situation now where they're damned if they speak and they're damned if they don't. It's something like that I'm trying to put myself in that place. I would expect that in the face of the most ruthless oppression of black and colored people, in the spaces which are mixed, maybe white people feel they've got nothing to say. But I'm wondering about what happens when white people are together, because we have no access to that space. So is there silence in those spaces of people who are self-reflective and aware and who may have just woken up to this? What happens there? Are white people prepared to disturb their place at the dinner table when they're surrounded by other white people? I really would like to hear about that, because it's very difficult to disrupt your own culture. And I'm sure black people feel it too in very traditional black settings, and Indians feel it in very traditional Indian settings. So that's one question. The second is about the portrayal of maids. I'm putting that in inverted commas, domestic workers. Now the mammy that you talk about, you see in, I just remember films like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, not One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, what is that? about the bird. Oh my God. To kill a mockingbird. To kill a mockingbird, and then the film that was called The Maid, in which you get a very different picture of a maid who shows a lot of agency and finds very subtle ways of, taking her back on back on the white mistresses. So you have very different images of domestic workers. And I wonder how much both black and white people reflect on the relationship they have with their own domestic workers, and how much of it is colored by an understanding of domestic workers as humans. It's a realization that came very late to Erin after she saw the Sibande's painting. So I'm interested in knowing how black middle-class women treat black domestic workers. How do Indian women treat black domestic workers? Is it all the same? It seems to me very often that we are in a space where we are so tentative about our meanings. It's like you can't put your finger on anything. So the moment you say one thing, you have to also immediately, in a way, be able to say the opposite of that. And then you have to say the opposite of that from another point of view. So looking at the painting where, I've forgotten the name of the artist, where she dresses as a man and surrounded by black, I think that was in
Jackson.
Amy's presentation.
Jackson.
Yeah, Jackson, black naked women. Now that reminded me so much of a Western painting, which is a picnic, I think, or a garden. Is it Manet or someone like that? Where the men are all dressed, there are many men, they're all dressed, and the woman is naked and available. So, there are so many connections and resonances. And I'm wondering if our educating ourselves and knowledge making really is about not limiting yourself to one understanding, but also saying that and immediately being able to say the next thing. And so we are always like open-ended, and we're always in a situation where we will never know. We will never be able to fix anything because of the transience of our understandings. So I just wanted to make those points. I don't know.
We're going to take one last comment from Nilika, then we're going to just get back to the presenters, and just in case they want to say something before we close tonight.
Okay, first Beverly, Amy and Erin, thank you so much for these presentations that exhibit the very things that we're here to do, is basically to discuss our physical, psychological, emotional reactions and place ourselves within the theorization of external things, and how those externals and the internals collide often without us exploring them. Historical things, colonial things, our personal practices, everyday, our employment practices essentially as well, and the ways of looking at things we call art, and how they too express ways of exploiting the gaze in many ways. So I'm really grateful for these presentations. I was thinking about the fact that often we don't interrogate positionality, and I think those are the ways in which we've inherited, essentially Western canonical ways of thinking, is to not interrogate what does it mean for me to have come from these politics and being positioned in these ways, and how does it affect the ways I look at this person, performative art or my domestic worker, and which even in changing the phrase that we use, be it the maid or the domestic worker, they're both ways of eliding the relationship we continue to have with the person who works for us for a very tiny amount of money. Like calling it a domestic worker almost rankles me so much, because it makes it sound like we now have a nice new age relationship with her. And we don't. Economically, not much has changed. So actually, I think two academics I know have a book out called Friendship in South Africa, John Soske and Shannon Walsh. And so I wrote about a chapter on the ways in which artists in South Africa have been really, really engaged with that idea of what does it mean to have this relationship with the person who works in your home, that you are completely dependent on in many ways, that your academic careers, your subjectivity as a privileged person of whatever racial background you have, is made by the person who is taking care of your children. Everybody from, Ernest Cole to Omar Bacha to George Hallett, and I'm talking photographers, right? And Mary Sibande, of course, and many, many artists and painters have explored that relationship. And what does this mean? Because obviously it is such a blight on our, that silence is there. And it is a guilty silence too, of which we cannot speak. Often, guilt and silence are together because, like Pumla said, like we think guilt is the stopping point. Like I feel guilty, I'm so sorry, done, finished, and it's done. But it's not an action. It's often a storing ground for inaction. So how to do that productively? Or with erasure of, or discourses that cover people's ownership of their art. What do you do to reclaim that ownership? And can the performance artists that you're speaking about claim a space with their bodies and performative bodies that use nudity and the shock of nudity without being objectified, because that objectification is always going to be there. I mean, even Butle talks about that because she says, how do I do this now? But yet I'm naked and black and, obviously very, very beautiful, attractive young woman. And then saying, okay, how do I now create that without, but it doesn't ever happen without, it's always an accompaniment. And until we can say it's still these complicated ways of seeing it are still present. Not that I can avert my eyes or rid myself of those ways of reading. It's still there. And there's no way you can do it without acknowledging that. If you acknowledge that, the silence begins to diminish. And then you have a way of speaking about it with acknowledging it, which begins a far more fruitful dialogue with responsibility, which I think is, far more productive. But it is a hard place to be. And race is not the only way of subjugating the other, because we've come from places that have ethnicity, skin shade, inherited titles, all of those things that like the country where my parents come from, which is Sri Lanka, they don't care about race. It's all about like your name and what class you came from and the ethnic group you come from. And they'll identify you according to your clan name, and that's all that. It's not about race. So race isn't the only way of doing it. So we all carry multiple ways of privileging ourselves and denigrating the other. So we all have to kind of discuss how we're going to see these layers whilst acknowledging it. Yeah.
Especially scholars, many of us are African feminists. In moving out of the house, there's somebody else who's taken over those roles for us. Our freedom comes at the expense of somebody else who's taking on those roles for us. Also, in terms of silence, I think also there's this kind of aggressive silence. We know it when you have a student in class who's not silent because they're feeling guilty. They're not silent because they're feeling discomfort. They're silent because they're withholding participation. It's like, I have to be here and I have to get through this course, but in no way am I actually going to engage you. At the end of the day, I'm going to leave this class, I'm going to get my degree, and I don't need to give a shit about what you're saying. That withholding, so the non-performativity that becomes a site of aggression. So I think also, this work on silence needs just to be so much more nuanced about what silence does and what silencing is. And then learning to dialogue, right? It's so important. I'm very wary of of kind of debates where it says you have no right to speak. Well, everybody has the right to speak and everybody has the right to be heard. But certainly groups of people have to learn how to talk to others. They need to relearn how to dialogue and to not hold the conversation about themselves, where almost everything then goes into a meanness and minus, and how that is a distinction where where race discourse and feminist discourse situates positionality as a form of authorizing knowledges that have been subjugated, as opposed to resituating that site of hegemony that's in our cultures. So I think it is important, and I think we always need, because I think this is with South Africa, right? We need to learn to talk. We need to learn how to speak to each other, and we need to learn how to engage. And Yvette, I'm sorry, but there's just no date on knowledge in which we find ourselves. No. We're gonna be using that 90s article for a long time to come. Okay, I'm just gonna give a few minutes for our participants to respond if you feel like it. Any of you feel like saying anything?
Oh, yeah. Do you want some water?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of respond like in general. When you said like what happens in those white spaces, you know, white people speaking to each other, all of this work and my visual art practice as well, it's dealing with like, it's so easy to disrupt those spaces. Just bringing up something that's slightly taboo. Those spaces are so fragile. Like, all of this, the way that I've been interrogating this space, navigating this space, has been like birthed out of that being a killjoy in those spaces. You know, because I think when you're learning, you're coming into feminism. For me, it was difficult. I was like, where do I fit here? Like, and like. You know, being quite like stuck sometimes, and it was Sarah Ahmed's paper where it like about being a killjoy, and I was like, yeah, well, this is where I fit, you know, and yeah, so that's what I started doing like from young, like disrupting those spaces, and what I always like hope is that like by disrupting those spaces, by making a scene, like ruining the dinner table, having my uncles like leave, and oh god, so many times. I hope that it causes one of them or like a few that are sitting there to change, you know, to change their thinking. But I've like you learn like very quickly that a lot of people you can't change their thinking, and that's like. Yeah, it's very difficult, especially like those students, ones that they like that aggressive silence. You can't control the way people think, you know. But yeah, so I guess
but
all of this.
Refuse to align with it.
So I think more than anything, like why I chose to like write the paper in like a sort of like to discursivize the paper is to show how I'm still like I don't really know which way I'm going. I'm still grappling with it. I'm hoping to like spark a dialogue between others, you know, open the space, because like I'm not done. This is just the beginning, and it's exciting, you know. And like the performance piece I'll do tonight as well deals with similar things, like literally disrupting the table. So like I hope that when you disrupt these spaces, when you create unhappiness or you create discomfort or supposedly create discomfort, sparks people to question that maybe am I creating discomfort, or am I exposing the discomfort that's already there, you know?
I agree with disrupting the white spaces. I also try to do the same whenever I hear something. I don't keep quiet about it, and I think that is a space where we can actively choose to not be silent in a way that's the most productive in these white spaces. Then in terms of the language thing that you asked me about, Humla, I think that these art spaces are still in the process of changing. English is still the primary language, and I think the way that we change that is from artists like Mbongo and Tiwani challenging that and using their own languages to for example, in Mbongo's performance, the audience was, I would say, mostly English speaking. So a lot of us were not understanding what was being said, but it was still such a passionate performance. And I think it's really important to do that, because it's just English is enforced on people so often. So that should change. I think that it needs to be shifted, and that's why I think that the titling in that way is very important.
I've been very inspired by all your comments, and I'm sorry to say that we need you, and you too. And it's part of aligning to what we're studying, art history and visual culture. So I am doing a bit of a mixture. Yeah. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay.
Can you see Mary Sibande's thing?
Can you put up an image while we're ending? Just a reminder as well about what people like bell hooks tell us, that coming to personal revelation is not an end in itself if it's not tied to wider activism and us changing society. Being brilliant and knowledgeable and critical by yourself doesn't really change all that much. So it's great that when we come to that, but we need to shift it beyond that.